So, several times you've mentioned the chakras and that we could take the 7 levels of development we've been talking about and correlate them with the chakras. And that's a little bit confusing to me in terms of the way that I understand each of the 7 energy centers in the body and what would normally be associated in a traditional chakra model with the level of consciousness. So could you bring the stage development model together for me with the chakras? And first, what are the chakras, according to Ken Wilber?
Well, the simple answer to the chakras is that most traditions maintain that there are anywhere from 4 to 7 or so major chakras and literally dozens to hundreds to thousands of minor chakras and subtle energy currents that they circulate. Basically what the chakras are is a kind of a subtle anatomy. They're subtle energy centers located in the precious human body. They have correlates in the gross human body. In other words, you can roughly locate them at the navel, for example, is where the 3rd chakra is, the genital area, 2nd chakra, 4th chakra, generally the heart area, 5th chakra, throat, 6th, the forehead, 7th, the crown of the head. And that's the gross body location of the chakras, which themselves are mostly subtle body energy centers that are in that general area of the gross body. And these subtle energy centers are ones that most people are familiar with because the kind of energy that they contain is the kind of energy that is manipulated in acupuncture. So acupuncture, which is very effective, as most people understand, it works, but it doesn't follow any of the gross nerves or gross muscles. The currents that the energy runs through doesn't really precisely follow gross anatomy. And yet it works. It works on pain, it works on mood, it works on all sorts of very subtle factors. The simplest explanation is that there are these subtle energy currents in the body, and there's sort of major vortexes of those are the chakras. As such, there are parts of the chakras that correspond to more like states. In other words, certain aspects of them are ever present. So even a young infant who's born, for example, has 7 chakras. The energies are there. They're not necessarily lit up or fully functioning, but they're there in the same way that the infant has a triune brain or a heart or a kidney. There's a subtle anatomy that comes with the precious human body. But there are also aspects of the chakras that are stage-like and that function and open in a stage-like way. Now here, frankly, the actual theory gets very complicated because each chakra as a stage has 3 states of energy, gross, subtle, and causal. And that's just what we really talked about earlier, which is that whatever stage conception, you can have these 3 great states. That's just what the chakra system maintains. There are 7 levels, and each of these 7 levels have 3 energy systems running through them. For 21 chakras altogether, if you see what I mean. That's very similar to that matrix we talked about. So whenever somebody gives a simple definition of chakra 1, the reason that they often vary is there are actually 3 chakras at chakra 1, and there are 3 chakras at chakra 2. You see what I mean? On gross, subtle, and causal with each of these. Generally, though, if you look at just kind of an overview of the stage-like components of the chakras, then the first chakra is material and material life, so it's oriented to food, physical survival, and so on. The second chakra is emotional sexual energy, and so it's life vitality, organic vitality and desire. The third chakra is power, so we're really moving into an intentionality and will. Say if somebody has guts, so we're moving into roughly what we call the egocentric level. And then when you get to the heart chakra, there are 3 heart chakras. And you can give very, very different definitions of them depending on which of those you choose. But you're basically starting to move much more into not just egocentric modes, which were the earlier ones, but you're moving into heart modes. So you're starting to relate to people, you're starting to have evidence, care, and compassion and concern, not just for yourself, but for others. And then as you move into the throat chakra, it's a verbal communication, it's rational, it's starting to get what we were calling level 4 to level 5 even, because now it's verbal communication with other people that are having verbal communication, and that means a rational level or higher usually. The 6th chakra is a very high, starting to become transpersonal and spiritual. It's often called the third eye, so it means it's intuitive knowledge as well. It tends to coordinate and integrate the previous chakras. So it's an integral chakra, which we were roughly calling level 6. And then level 7, or chakra 7, is the crown, or Sahasrara. And that's classically the 1,000-petaled lotus of light, love, luminosity, and bliss, and represents in general the transpersonal spiritual domains as a stage. And higher chakras are available. They're said to be anywhere from 7 to 12 chakras higher or within the Sahasrara, and so on. And there are aspects of it that, again, show state and not just stage components. But those are roughly, the chakras looked at as 7 stages or unfolding capacities. And they also show that we have everything from the lowest, which is matter, to animal, to human, to transcendental God, all tucked in to this anatomy of ours, which is, cool.
Well, when you bring up the gross, subtle, and causal level of each chakra, I think that helps me understand how the model applies, especially when you can look at somebody and say, oh, their 5th chakra or their 4th chakra seems very open.
Right.
But some of the lower chakras
That's right.
clearly seem to have issues going on.
Exactly.
And so you think, well, if it's a stage model, how does this make sense?
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. And the fact that you can have these 3 great states at each of the chakras accounts for that. And also remember that even the parts that do develop, the parts of the chakras that have a developmental unfolding, a young infant can be moving through the 2nd and 3rd chakra and split some of that energy and awareness off. We were talking about subpersonalities. And so then they can come up, they can do really quite well, even in some of the higher ones, but there's some real problems in some of the lower capacities. And so that kind of unevenness is also very possible. And there are even aspects of the traditions that understand levels and lines. So there's a sense in which the 7 chakras have a cognitive stream that runs through them, and an emotional stream that runs through them, and an interpersonal stream that runs through them. So somebody can be cognitively quite high in a chakra and emotionally at very, very low chakras. So again, these are, because reality itself is so complex, what you want to do with a map is find just enough to make it useful and not enough to drive you crazy. Because you don't want the map to have as much stuff as the reality, or what good is it? You can just mope your way through the damn reality, and you don't need a map for that. But so you want to simplify it. And a great simplification is the 7 chakras. But when you start pushing it, you run into problems. And then when you look at the real theory, you find that each of the chakras has these 3 great realms or states going with it. Now you have 21 chakras, and there it gets interesting. And there it covers most of the territory much better, but then it's a bigger, clumsier map.
When you talk about chakras that are higher than the 7 that are located in the human body, that's also interesting to me, because I know some of the authors that we work with at Sounds True have claimed that the chakras are in the human body. And I've always thought, well, this is kind of strange. How can the chakras be in the human body if there are chakras that are higher than the top of your head? And I guess what you're saying is that perhaps the gross body is left behind at that point, and those chakras are in the subtle and causal bodies.
Well, that's where it gets really, really interesting. And this is where you can bring in really the gross, subtle, and causal components at each of the 7 chakras. Now, if we just focus on gross, subtle, and causal energies just generically, and those correspond, as we were saying, to the 3 great states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. So these are energies and bodies that everybody has available to them. And so the gross body and its physical energies are pretty obvious, that the gross physical body here and the energies around it, gravitational, electromagnetic, and so on. Then the subtle body itself, even though in a sense anchored in the gross body, tends to, whether you're talking about the etheric or the astral or the psychic aspects of it, these are sort of subdivisions, kind of surrounds and tends to have the aura, in a sense, that psychics perceive, or that sensitive human beings can perceive. And the aura can sometimes extend several feet beyond the body, and it pulses, it gets bigger, it gets smaller, depending on your own energetic component at the moment. And then enveloping that and around that is a causal field. And the causal field is very, very fine, very subtle, and it extends to infinity. I mean, it really just goes and goes and goes. And every chakra, the 7 chakras, have those 3 components in them. So every chakra has a gross component, whether the genitals or the navel or the heart, and it has a subtle component that is energy radiating around that, not strictly a gross body, although it's obviously part of our organism, and then a causal field surrounding it that basically extends to infinity. The traditions make 2 claims. One is that, and I think both these claims have some validity to them, although one of them is harder to prove. The first claim is that all 3 of these energy fields are, in a sense, enveloped So you can't really say that subtle and causal energies are nothing but gross body, or else it would just be the gross body. There wouldn't be subtle and causal bodies. It'd just be one big, lumpy, gross body.
Very gross.
It's very gross and very grotesque. I mean, it's like the Hulk. I think it would look like the Hulk, maybe. You actually see the subtle body kind of pulsing around. So it's not just gross body. That would be gross reductionism. But on the other hand, it's not something that's out floating around. While you're alive, it's anchored in the physical organism, the gross body. And that includes the subtle and causal energies. So they happen, my subtle and causal bodies are centered and located around this gross body. My subtle body is not sitting over in that chair, and my causal body isn't over in that chair. So a lot of people working with chakras try to emphasize that anchored component, that they're really here, they're anchored here, they're not some metaphysical airy-fairy kind of stuff. Traditions also maintain that upon death, the gross body dissolves, and you then exist actually in your subtle body of subtle energy, and that subtle body and subtle energy is what transmigrates from one life to another. And so in that sense, it's not merely anchored in the gross body, so it extends beyond it in some sense. And then there's a kind of a ultimate interpretation, if you will, which is that if you look at the causal body that extends to infinity as being roughly synonymous with emptiness, then that's prior to the Big Bang. And that's the aspect that starts to go into that complete formless realm that's not in any way anchored in gross physical reality. All physical reality comes out of it, but it is itself not mired down in a mere gross body. But I think the really important thing, because that can get a little bit far out, I think the really important thing that's somewhat similar to people you're talking about is that the chakras really are part of your body, and that you have a gross, subtle, and causal body. So it's an embodied part of your own being, but not just merely skeletons and bones and the physical part that you see. That the body that you have is actually much more radiant than the physical thing sort of sitting here.